The storm hit harder than the forecast promised, the kind of sudden downpour that turns a quiet evening into chaos within about 10 minutes. I was in my kitchen when I heard it, rain hammering the windows so loud I had to turn down the radio to hear myself think, and it was somewhere in the middle of that noise that I heard the knock at my door, sharp and urgent, nothing like the polite little taps my neighbors usually gave when they wanted to borrow sugar or complain about the mail carrier. I opened it to find Marlow standing on my porch, soaked through despite the short distance between our two houses, hair plastered to her forehead, eyes wide with the particular panic of someone whose evening had just gone sideways. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, talking fast, the words tumbling out ahead of themselves. "My roof is leaking. Badly. Like, actual water coming through the ceiling in my bedroom, and I don't know what to do, and I know it's late, and I know this is a huge ask, but I didn't know who else to call, and you're the only person on this street I actually know well enough to knock on their door during a storm like a crazy person." "You're not a crazy person," I said, already reaching for my jacket off the hook by the door. "Let me grab some things. Give me 2 minutes." Marlow and I had lived 2 houses apart for almost 3 years, the kind of neighbors who started as polite wave-across-the-yard acquaintances and slowly, over countless small interactions, borrowed tools, watched pets during vacations, the occasional shared dinner when one of us cooked too much and didn't want it to go to waste, became something closer to real friends. I liked her, more than I usually let myself admit even privately, in the specific quiet way you like someone you've watched be steady and kind and funny over years instead of weeks, without ever doing anything about it because neighbors, in my experience, made things complicated in a way that felt too risky to test. I grabbed a flashlight, a tarp I kept in the garage for exactly this kind of emergency, my toolbox, and followed her back through the rain to her house, both of us soaked through by the time we made it up her porch steps. Inside, the damage was immediately obvious, a dark, spreading stain on her bedroom ceiling, water dripping steadily into a bucket she'd already placed underneath it, though from the size of the wet patch on the carpet, the bucket clearly hadn't been in place quite fast enough. "It started about 20 minutes ago," she said, wringing water out of the end of her sleeve, looking at the ceiling with the specific helpless frustration of someone facing a problem they had no idea how to solve. "1 minute everything was fine, and then I heard this dripping sound, and by the time I found where it was coming from, it had already soaked through most of the ceiling." "Do you know where the leak's actually coming from?" "Up in the attic, I mean." "I have no idea. I've never actually been up there. This house came with an attic access panel and I've spent 3 years pretending it doesn't exist." I almost laughed, despite the circumstances, because it was such a specifically Marlow thing to admit, and even in the middle of a genuine emergency, some part of me registered how much I liked that about her, the easy, self-deprecating honesty she brought to almost everything. "Let's go find out," I said. "Attic access panel, you said?" She led me to a small pull-down ladder in her hallway closet, and I climbed up with the flashlight while she held it steady from below, calling up occasional worried questions about what I could see. The attic itself was cramped and cold, rain hammering directly overhead now that I was closer to the roof, and it didn't take long to find the source, a section of shingles that had come loose, probably during an earlier storm and never noticed, now letting water pour directly through a gap in the underlying wood. "Found it," I called down. "It's not great, but it's fixable, at least temporarily. I can get a tarp over it from outside to stop the worst of it tonight, and you'll need an actual roofer out here in the next day or two to do a real repair." "You're going to go up on the roof? In this storm?" "Not the whole roof. Just enough to get the tarp secured over the gap." "I'll be careful." "Absolutely not," she said, her voice sharp with sudden alarm. "You are not climbing onto my roof in the middle of a thunderstorm. That's how people actually die, doing exactly that kind of thing. Marlow, the water's going to keep coming through until someone stops it. Then we put more buckets down and deal with the actual repair tomorrow, in daylight, when it's not actively lightning outside. I am not letting you fall off my roof over a leak." I climbed back down the ladder, dripping, and found her standing in the hallway with her arms crossed, an expression on her face that made it very clear this particular argument wasn't going to go my way regardless of how reasonable I thought my position was. "Fine," I said. "No roof tonight. But we should at least reroute what water we can, minimize the damage until it's safe to go up there properly." That I can agree to, she said, some of the tension easing out of her shoulders now that the more dangerous plan was off the table. We spent the next hour working through her house by flashlight, since the storm had knocked out power somewhere along the line, moving furniture out from under the worst of the dripping, setting out every bucket and bowl she owned, and rigging a rough plastic sheet under the ceiling stain to funnel water more directly into the containers instead of letting it spread across the carpet. It was messy, unglamorous work, both of us soaked and cold and occasionally laughing despite ourselves at the absurdity of the whole situation. At one point a bucket overflowed the second we turned our backs, sending a fresh cascade onto the floor, and we both just stood there for a second, staring at it, before dissolving into the kind of tired, slightly hysterical laughter that comes from too much stress and not enough sleep. This is not how I pictured tonight going, she said, mopping up the overflow with a towel that was already too wet to do much good. I had a whole plan. Order food, watch something terrible on television, be asleep by 10. Instead, I'm mopping up rainwater at midnight with my neighbor, both of us soaked to the bone. Could be worse, I said. At least you have a neighbor who owns a tarp. Small mercies, she agreed, smiling despite everything, and something about the low light and the quiet after the frantic first hour of crisis management made the moment feel unexpectedly intimate. The two of us crouched together on her bedroom floor, close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off her despite how cold and wet we both were. By the time we'd done everything reasonably possible without actually going up on the roof, the worst of the storm had passed, the hammering rain softening into something steadier and less violent, thunder rolling further off in the distance instead of directly overhead. Power was still out, the house lit only by the flashlight and a couple of candles Marlow had dug out from a kitchen drawer, and there was something almost peaceful about the quiet that settled over the place once the emergency part of the evening was handled. You should get home, she said, though something in her voice made the suggestion sound less than fully committed. You're soaked, it's late, you've done more than enough already tonight. I really can't thank you enough for coming over. It's fine. What are neighbors for? Still. I feel bad. You probably had actual plans tonight before I showed up banging on your door like the world was ending. My plan was leftover pasta and a documentary about deep-sea creatures I've already seen twice, I admitted. You didn't interrupt anything important. She laughed, and walked me toward the front door, both of us moving a little slower than the distance really required, neither of us in an obvious hurry to end the night despite how late it had gotten. At the door, I reached for the handle, ready to head back out into the rain and the two-house walk home, and that's when she said it, quiet, almost like she surprised herself by saying it out loud. Don't leave yet. I turned back to look at her, standing in the candlelight, hair still damp and slightly wild from the storm, an expression on her face that was harder to read than her usual open, easy manner. You want me to stay a while longer? Help finish setting up the containers, or? No, she said. I mean, yes, but that's not really what I meant. She hesitated, wrapping her arms around herself, and I watched her work through whatever she was about to say the same careful way I'd watched her work through problems before, methodically, like she needed to get the words in the right order before she trusted herself to say them out loud. I meant I don't want you to leave yet because I don't want the night to end yet. Not with you, specifically. I've been trying to figure out how to say something like that to you for a while now, and I never seem to find the right moment, and I think maybe tonight, with everything already so upside down, might just be it. I stood there by her front door, rain still falling steadily outside, candlelight flickering against the walls, and felt something in my chest go very still, the way it does right before you realize a conversation is about to change everything. What are you trying to say? I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer, hardly daring to hope it was the thing I'd been quietly wanting to hear for longer than I'd ever admitted to anyone, including myself. I like you, she said, simply, like ripping off a bandage was easier than dragging the moment out any further. Not just as a neighbor, not just as a friend who happens to live 2 houses down. I've liked you for a while now, actually, longer than I've been willing to say anything about, because I didn't want to risk making things weird between us if you didn't feel the same way. We're neighbors. If this went badly, I'd still have to see you across the yard every single day, and that felt like too big a risk to take on a feeling I wasn't sure was even mutual. I know exactly that feeling, I said. Because I've been sitting on the same thing, for about as long, probably. Watching you across the yard, telling myself it was safer to just enjoy being your friend than risk asking for something more and losing even that. Her expression shifted, surprise and relief moving across her face in quick succession. You mean that? You're not just saying it because I said it first? I mean it completely. I've thought about telling you more than once. I just never found a moment that felt right, the same way you apparently didn't either. I think we've both been standing on opposite sides of the exact same hesitation for a while now. That's absurd, she said, half laughing, half something more emotional. We live 2 houses apart. We've had 100 conversations that could have been the moment, and instead it took my roof falling apart in a thunderstorm to finally force the issue. In my defense, most emergencies don't come with a natural opening for this kind of conversation. This one just happened to. I suppose that's true. She stepped a little closer, close enough now that the space between us had shrunk to almost nothing, candlelight catching the side of her face, both of us still faintly damp from the storm, standing in a hallway that smelled like rain and old candle wax. So, now that it's actually said out loud, what do we do about it? I don't know exactly, I admitted. But I know I meant it when you asked me not to leave yet. I don't want to leave. Not tonight, and honestly, not in the bigger sense either. I'd like to see where this actually goes, if you would. I would, she said, without any hesitation at all, and reached up, resting her hand against my jaw the same careful, deliberate way I'd watched her handle difficult decisions all evening, and kissed me, soft and a little uncertain at first, like she was still checking that this was really happening and not some strange trick of the storm and the candlelight in the exhausted, adrenaline strange hour. I kissed her back, certain in a way I hadn't let myself be certain about anything in a long time, and when she finally pulled back, she was smiling in a way I'd never quite seen from her before, something unguarded and genuinely happy underneath the exhaustion of the whole strange night. For the record, she said, this is a significantly better ending to tonight than I was expecting when I knocked on your door 2 hours ago. For the record, I said, I take a leaking roof over a boring evening of pasta and documentaries any day, if this is how it ends. We didn't sleep much that night, staying up talking on her couch by candlelight until the power finally kicked back on somewhere around 3 in the morning, both of us too wired on the strange, happy adrenaline of the whole evening to really consider going to bed. We talked about the 1.5 years of careful, unspoken feelings we'd apparently both been sitting on, comparing notes on all the moments either of us had almost said something and talked ourselves back out of it, laughing at how obvious it all seemed in hindsight, how much time we could have saved each other if either of us had just worked up the nerve sooner. The roofer came out 2 days later, exactly as I'd predicted, and fixed the actual damage properly, and Marlow insisted on paying me back for the tarp and the ruined towels despite my telling her repeatedly it wasn't necessary, settling the debt instead with a home-cooked dinner that turned into the first of what became a regular thing between us, evenings that used to be spent separately in our own houses now spent together more often than not, the short walk between our 2 front doors. Becoming so familiar that within a few months it barely felt like 2 separate households at all. We took our time with it, deliberately, both of us aware that whatever we were building needed to be sturdier than the impulsive rush of one storm-soaked night, however good that night had turned out to be. But 6 months in, when her lease came up for renewal, we found ourselves having a very different conversation than either of us probably expected to have that first stormy evening, not about roofs or leaks, but about whether it made sense anymore to keep paying for 2 separate houses when most nights found us together in one of them anyway. We could just make it official, she said one evening, curled up on my couch this time, the 2 of us having long since stopped keeping careful track of whose house we were in on any given night. Pick one house, move everything into it properly, stop pretending we're still just very friendly neighbors who happen to spend every evening together. Which house? I asked. Yours has the better kitchen. Mine has the better yard. We'll negotiate, she said, laughing. I'm sure we can find a compromise that doesn't involve either of us being too stubborn about square footage. We settled, eventually, on her house, mostly because of the kitchen, though I made her promise to let me redo the roof properly first, a full replacement instead of a patch job, since I wasn't about to spend the rest of my life bracing for the next big storm to reopen the same leak that had, in its own strange way, brought us together in the first place. A year after that first stormy night, we hosted a small dinner for the same neighbors who'd spent months teasing us gently about the sudden, obvious shift in our relationship, several of them admitting they'd wondered for a while whether something might eventually happen between the two of us, watching us fall into an easy, comfortable rhythm long before either of us admitted it out loud. "You have that roof to thank, really," one neighbor said, raising a glass during the meal, only half joking. "Best home repair emergency this street's ever seen." "Don't give the roof too much credit," Marlow said, leaning into my side with the same easy warmth she'd had since that very first night. "It just gave us the excuse. We'd have gotten there eventually, storm or no storm." "Maybe," I said. "But I'm glad it happened the way it did. Gave us a good story, at least, for whenever people ask how we ended up together." "Her roof was leaking in a storm," she said, smiling up at me, "and he helped her fix it, and then she asked him not to leave yet. That's the whole story, really. Simple, once you get down to it." "Simple," I agreed, "and probably the best decision either of us ever made, however it happened to come about." Outside, rain began to patter softly against the windows again, an ordinary evening shower instead of anything dramatic, and neither of us so much as glanced toward the ceiling to check for leaks, because the roof, at least, had long since been thoroughly fixed, and the rest of it, the part that actually mattered, had turned out to need no fixing at all, just two people finally willing to say, out loud, the thing they'd both been quietly hoping the other one already knew.